Hey everyone, 91% of you aren't subscribed yet. It's free and helps us bring more epic space and sci-fi content your way. I'm aiming for 10k subscribers next year, and every bit of support means a lot. If you're not feeling it, no worries, but I hope you'll stick around for the ride. It was supposed to be another routine mission, another scientific endeavor, one that would inch humanity closer to understanding the farthest reaches of the universe. But the discovery was anything but ordinary. When the expedition team of Arcadia 12 set their course for Glea 581G, a planet in the Goldilocks zone of the nearby star system, they expected to find something extraordinary, possibly alien life, or at the very least, remnants of civilizations from eons past. What they found, however, was far worse. Dr. Eleanor Vance stood in the observation deck of their ship, staring out into the depths of space, her thoughts as dark as the void outside. The news had just come in. An anomaly was detected on the planet's surface. A team of scientists had been scouring the planet's satellite images when they found something that didn't make sense. A massive, unnatural structure, far too symmetrical to be the work of nature. It looked like a building, but the designs were something no human architect would recognize. "Look at this," Elena whispered to herself, glancing down at the tablet in her hands. She'd been reviewing the data when the first hints of something wrong began to form in her mind. The structure, once believed to be a strange mountain formation, was unmistakably a city, or what had once been a city. As the rest of the crew gathered around her, they saw the same image, and their faces reflected her growing unease. "I think we should investigate," said Captain Mark Reynolds, his voice calm, but with an edge of uncertainty. "But we need to proceed with caution. The last thing we want is to find something that we can't control." A collective silence passed over the room. Everyone on board Arcadia 12 had signed up for adventure and discovery, but this was no longer just about exploring unknown territory. This was something more, something darker. What kind of civilization had built something so unnatural? "Prepare the landing gear," Captain Reynolds said, his tone shifting. "We're going down." The descent was long, agonizingly so, as the ship pierced through the planet's dense atmosphere. The clouds outside were thick and stormy, but the data from the ship's sensors indicated that the storm was artificial. The readings were erratic, far beyond anything that should have been expected from a natural weather system. Something was creating this chaotic environment, and it wasn't just the strange city ahead. Eleanor's mind raced as the ship descended through layers of swirling clouds. She wasn't sure why, but the air outside felt heavy, as though the very atmosphere carried the weight of a terrible secret. Something was wrong with this planet, and the closer they got, the more she could feel it, like a pressure building behind her ribs, the taste of metal in her mouth. When the ship finally broke through the clouds, they were greeted with a vast, barren landscape. The city stood in the distance, looming over the wasteland like a sentinel. But as the ship approached, Eleanor's stomach twisted with dread. There was something horribly off about the place. The buildings, once massive and imposing, were now hollow husks of twisted, darkened metal and stone. Jagged spires rose into the air like the fingers of a corpse, reaching for the sky in unnatural angles. Windows, if they could even be called that, were wide open and empty, like hollow eyes that had once seen too much. Captain Reynolds gave the order to land, and the ship's engines hummed with quiet power as they descended towards the cracked earth below. The landscape was eerily silent, no signs of movement, no birds in the sky, no animals scurrying in the distance. The air smelled faintly of sulfur, mingled with the strange metallic tang of decay. The landing gear thudded against the ground, and the crew disembarked, their boots crunching on the barren soil. It was cold, despite the sun's light filtering through the clouds, and the wind carried an unsettling, almost mournful howl as it swept across the empty landscape. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She scanned the horizon, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the empty ruins of the strange city. The air felt too still. "We'll need to be quick," Reynolds muttered, as he motioned for the crew to follow. "Check the surroundings. Make sure there are no hostile forces." But Eleanor was already looking at something else. She had noticed something strange as they approached the city from above. A shadow shifting in the corners of the ruins. She wasn't sure if it was an optical illusion or something else entirely, but something was alive down there. The crew made their way cautiously towards the city centre. As they walked, Eleanor couldn't help but study the terrain. There were no signs of any living organisms, no plants, no insects. It was as if the entire ecosystem had collapsed, leaving behind only remnants of what once was. "I've never seen a place like this," muttered Lieutenant Derek Brooks, his voice uneasy as he scanned the area with a high-powered rifle slung over his shoulder. "It's like everything was erased." The further they walked, the more the city seemed to press in on them. The buildings, though massive and crumbling, were unnervingly close together. The spaces between them narrowed, making the group feel like they were being funneled towards some inevitable destination. Eleanor noticed the path ahead, a strange spiral leading into the heart of the city, but it was the markings on the walls that caught her attention. Carvings. But not just any carvings. They were intricate, grotesque depictions of strange creatures, half human and half animal, twisted into impossible forms. Some had limbs in places they shouldn't be. Others had faces that were elongated and misshapen. The eyes in the carvings were always wide and staring, as if watching their every move. "What do you make of these?" asked Dr. Owen Green, one of the expedition's biologists, as he stepped up beside Eleanor. She ran her fingers over one of the carvings, tracing the alien symbols etched into the rock. There was no doubt about it. Whoever had made these was not just capable of complex thought, but had delved into something far darker. "I don't know," Eleanor said softly, but I think we're looking at something more than just a city. This place it's a warning." Just then, a low sound echoed from somewhere deep within the city, a hollow, resonant vibration that seemed to reverberate through the very air. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. It was something far deeper, far older. A scream split the air. The scream pierced the heavy silence of the desolate city, an unnatural wail that seemed to come from deep within the heart of the ruin. It wasn't a human voice. The pitch was too high, too guttural, and yet there was something unmistakably familiar about it. Eleanor's blood ran cold, her instincts urging her to retreat, but her legs felt frozen, as if bound to the ground by some unseen force. The other members of the crew reacted similarly. The air seemed to have thickened, pressing in on them from all sides, but no one dared speak. The scream faded into a low, drawn-out hiss, followed by a long, drawn-out silence. Captain Reynolds was the first to move, his hand going to the sidearm holstered at his waist. "Brooks, take the lead," he ordered, his voice tight with the first true tension Eleanor had heard from him. "Everyone stay alert. We move in formation." Brooks, a tall, athletic figure with a no-nonsense demeanour, nodded. He adjusted his rifle, scanning the cracked and broken landscape ahead with sharp eyes. Slowly he led them forward, keeping a watchful eye on every shadow and crack in the ruins. As the group moved deeper into the city, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Eleanor's breath quickened, each step echoing in the hollow silence of the empty streets. The stone buildings loomed overhead like crooked sentinels, their windows dark and empty, watching them with eyes that had not blinked in centuries. The further they ventured into the city, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air was thick with a stench, something foul like decay and rot, but mixed with a sharp, metallic scent that made Eleanor's stomach turn. Then the ground beneath them began to change. The concrete pavement cracked open in long, jagged lines, revealing something far worse beneath the surface. "Wait," Brooks hissed, halting the group. He crouched low to the ground, tapping his communicator. "There's something under us." Elena peered over his shoulder, heart thudding in her chest. Beneath the cracked pavement, there was movement, subtle but unmistakable. The ground seemed to twitch and ripple, as though something was shifting below it, like a massive organism stirring from a long slumber. Before anyone could react, a sound came from the depths of the earth, a low, guttural rumble, as if something enormous was shifting its weight. The ground vibrated beneath their boots, and then, with a terrible, sickening screech, something erupted from the earth. It was massive, a creature, or what was left of a creature. Its form was incomprehensible, a grotesque mishmash of twisted limbs and grotesque features. The body was long, segmented like some sort of insect, with thick, chitinous armor plating covering most of its bloated frame. Its face, if it could be called that, was a mess of flailing tendrils, pulsating with unnatural life. From its abdomen hung a cluster of sharp, bone-like protrusions, dripping with some viscous fluid. The thing hissed as it loomed over them, its eyes, if they could be called eyes, flickering with an unnatural, predatory intelligence. The creature screeched again, this time with a horrifying, blood-curdling wail, its tendrils lashing outward toward the crew. "Move!" Reynolds shouted, drawing his weapon. Brooks opened fire first, his rifle sending a barrage of bullets into the thing's thick hide, but the rounds barely seemed to penetrate. The creature flailed its monstrous limbs, knocking several chunks of debris toward the group, forcing them to scatter. "Get to cover," Reynolds ordered, firing his sidearm at the creature as it writhed and twisted on the ground. Eleanor, adrenaline surging through her veins, scrambled behind one of the nearby ruins, her pulse racing as she took cover. Her mind was barely processing what was happening. The creature was real. It wasn't just a relic of the past. It was alive, and it was angry. "Brooks, fall back," Reynolds called out, but before he could say anything more, the creature's segmented body twisted, and a tendril shot out from beneath its bloated form, wrapping around Brooks's leg and dragging him toward its gaping maw. "No!" Brooks screamed, thrashing against the thick appendage, but it was too strong. The others fired desperately at the creature, but it was clear now that bullets weren't enough. The thing's thick hide was impervious to their weapons. Elena felt the world shift around her. She could hear Brooks's panicked shouts as he was dragged towards the creature's mouth, the shrieking, wet sound of its jaws snapping open in preparation to devour him. Without thinking, she sprinted forward, her heart pounding in her chest as she grabbed a large metal rod from a pile of debris. She wasn't sure what she was thinking, only that she had to help. She swung it at the nearest tendril that was holding Brooks, but it was like trying to strike a snake made of iron. The rod bent under the force of the tendril's grip. "Get off him!" Elena screamed, desperate. In that moment, the creature's massive, bulbous eyes fixed on her, and a terrible, malicious intelligence glinted within them. It let out another hiss, more distinct this time, almost as if it was savouring the moment. Brooks's cries were cut short with a final, sickening sound of cracking bones. Reynolds shouted in fury, unloading his sidearm into the creature's face. The creature screamed, thrashing violently, and in an unexpected moment of vulnerability, it released Brooks. The corpse of their comrade was flung aside like a rag doll, his body mangled beyond recognition. "Brooks!" Reynolds screamed. But there was no time to mourn. The creature was now fully aware of their presence, and it was closing in fast. "Retreat!" Elena shouted, her voice hoarse with panic. "We need to get back to the ship, now!" Without waiting for a response, she sprinted toward the path they had come, adrenaline fueling her every step. Reynolds and the others followed her, but the sound of the creature's pursuit was close behind. Its horrible, shrieking calls echoed through the ruins, each one sending a spike of terror straight to her heart. As they reached the outskirts of the city, Elena's heart skipped a beat. The ship was still there, but it was surrounded by more of them. More twisted, insectoid horrors had emerged from beneath the ground, their eyes glinting like feral animals, their bodies twitching with hunger. "God help us," she whispered under her breath, a cold shiver running down her spine. The crew gathered in a huddle near the ship, out of sight from the approaching horrors. There was no longer any pretense of control or organization. Fear gripped them entirely. They were being hunted. And worse, they were beginning to realize that they were not the only ones on this planet. Elena's mind was racing. The planet, Glea 581G, wasn't just a strange twin Earth. It was a planet where evolution had gone terribly wrong. The creatures they were facing were not alien life forms. They were the result of evolution run amok. In their attempts to conquer the environment, these beings had adapted in the most grotesque ways, each one a nightmarish parody of life. They had become predators, carnivores, and parasites, each evolution designed to make them more efficient at hunting, killing, and absorbing whatever life remained on this planet. But what had caused this perversion? As Elena crouched by the ship, catching her breath, she began to connect the dots. The carvings in the city weren't just art. They were warnings, messages from a civilization that had once lived here. The twisted creatures, the decaying buildings, the echoes of screams. This was what happened when a species ignored the balance of nature, when it manipulated the environment and its own biology to the point of madness. "We need to leave," Reynolds said, his voice breaking through Elena's thoughts. "Now, before we end up like them." But Elena couldn't shake the feeling that it was too late. They had found the twin Earth, all right, but what they had uncovered was no paradise. This was a place where evolution had spiraled into a grotesque nightmare, and somehow they were part of it now. They weren't just trapped in a foreign world. They were in the final stages of its terrible transformation. The air around the Arcadia 12 was thick with dread, the wind howling with an unnatural intensity, as if the planet itself were trying to warn them away. Elena's hands trembled as she clutched the metal panel near the ship's entrance, staring into the decaying city behind them. The shadow of the creatures loomed over them, not just in size, but in their presence, their hunger. It was as if the entire planet were alive, watching, waiting for the next move. They had barely made it back to the ship when the creatures first appeared, emerging from cracks in the earth and the collapsed structures of the city, their eyes gleaming with an intelligence that was as ancient as it was terrifying. They hadn't just been defending their territory. They'd been waiting for something or someone. And now that they had made contact with the crew, there was no turning back. Elena's heart pounded in her chest, every instinct telling her to run, but she couldn't. Not yet. There was something gnawing at her mind, a feeling that the answers they needed weren't just out there in the city, but hidden somewhere far darker. "Reynolds, we can't just leave," she said, the voice barely a whisper as the others crowded around her, fear and confusion clouding their faces. "What do you mean?" Reynolds asked, his gaze darting between the group. "The creatures are out there. We need to get off this planet, now." "I'm not talking about the creatures," Elena replied, swallowing hard. "I'm talking about the city. We don't know what happened here. The carvings, the creatures. There's more to this than we're seeing. We need to find out what went wrong." Reynolds shook his head. "And we need to survive. Whatever happened here, it's over. There's no point in trying to understand it. We're lucky we're still alive. We need to leave." The rest of the crew exchanged uncertain looks, but Eleanor could see the hesitation in their eyes. They all knew that something more than just a biological nightmare had brought the planet to this point. Something far darker. Eleanor made a decision. "We're not leaving. Not yet," she said, her voice more resolute than she felt. "We're going back into the city. We need to understand what happened here. If we don't, we won't just be fighting for survival. We'll be fighting against an unknown force, something we don't understand. And that's worse than any monster we've seen." Captain Reynolds' face darkened. "You're playing with fire, Vance." Eleanor's voice lowered, her eyes narrowing in determination. "We're already in the flames. I'm going back in." It didn't take long for them to regroup. Brooks's death, still fresh in their minds, had silenced the crew into a grim obedience. They moved like shadows through the desolate streets of the city, the oppressive silence weighing down on them. It was as though even the wind had been forced into submission by the creatures lurking just beyond the ruins. The closer they got to the center of the city, the more Eleanor felt in it. That sense of wrongness, of something terrible hiding beneath the surface. The carvings had been only the beginning. Now, as they ventured deeper, they began to see other signs. Skulls, bodies, remains of creatures that had been twisted and altered in ways beyond recognition. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the oppressive silence was punctuated only by the sound of their footsteps, muffled, as though the very ground was trying to swallow them whole. Eleanor paused, her eyes scanning the buildings ahead. A new kind of architecture emerged here, not the jagged spires, but vast, circular structures, their entrances blocked off by what appeared to be some kind of translucent membrane. The walls were covered in more intricate carvings, but these were different, more refined, almost beautiful in their alien intricacy. "Look at this," Dr. Green murmured, his voice quivering with a mix of awe and terror. Eleanor stepped forward, brushing her fingers against the smooth, glass-like membrane. The carvings here weren't violent or grotesque, but instead depicted long, elegant figures. Humanoid, yes, but elongated, with features that seemed too perfect. Their bodies were adorned with strange symbols, their faces serene and godlike. "They were worshipping something," Eleanor whispered, her heart beat faster. "But what?" Before anyone could respond, the ground trembled again. This time, the shaking was stronger, more insistent. There was a deep, rumbling sound, as if the planet itself was protesting their presence. The walls of the circular building shifted, and slowly, agonizingly, the membrane began to retract. "I don't like this," Reynolds muttered. "We should leave, now." But Eleanor had already stepped forward, drawn to the opening that was now before them. As the membrane peeled away completely, the interior of the structure came into view. It wasn't empty. There, in the center of the chamber, was a large obsidian altar surrounded by more of the strange humanoid figures. But these figures were different. They were no longer beautiful or serene. They were decayed, their bodies twisted and ravaged by time and whatever had befallen the planet. In the center of the altar was a single blackened stone, pulsating with an eerie, unnatural light. As they stepped closer, Eleanor could feel it. The air was thick with energy, something ancient, something alive. It was as if the stone was breathing, its pulse echoing through the chamber, resonating deep within her bones. "Do you feel that?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Dr. Green replied, his voice tight. "It's alive." Reynolds took a step back, his hand on his weapon. "What the hell is this? This isn't what we came here for." "We didn't come here for this, but we found it," Eleanor said, her gaze fixed on the stone. "This is what they were trying to warn us about." Suddenly, the walls around them began to tremble violently. The figures that lined the chamber, once statues, now living, breathing horrors, began to move. Their bodies stretched unnaturally, twisting and contorting, their faces now grotesque masks of pain and madness. "We need to go," Reynolds said urgently. "This is a mistake." But it was too late. The ground beneath them cracked open, and from the abyss below, creatures like nothing they had ever seen before, began to emerge. With their limbs spread wide and their eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence, the monsters moved quickly, their speed unnatural. Their bodies were long and slick like some kind of serpentine insect. But their faces were the worst part. Each one had a face like the figures in the carvings, serene, perfect, but now grotesque with twisted mockery. Their mouths opened wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and from within their throats a horrible sound erupted, like a mixture of laughter and despair. They had been waiting for this. The creatures surged forward with inhuman speed, their jaws snapping. Elena barely had time to react, her body moving on instinct, as she ducked beneath one of the monster's massive claws. The others scrambled, but it was clear that there was no escape. They had triggered something far worse than they had ever imagined. Reynolds fired at the nearest creature, but his shots had no effect. The bullets ricocheted off its glossy, impenetrable skin. Dr. Green was screaming, trying to push one of the creatures back with his hands, but it was too strong. Elena grabbed a piece of broken stone and hurled it at one of the advancing creatures. It didn't even flinch. The stone bounced off it like it was nothing. "We need to destroy the altar," Elena shouted, panic rising in her throat. "It's controlling them." Without waiting for confirmation, she sprinted towards the altar. The stone pulsated faster, its light growing more intense, more blinding. The creatures roared in unison, their screeches deafening. Reynolds and the others followed, firing their weapons desperately as they made their way toward the altar. It was their only chance, but they didn't know how much time they had before the creatures overwhelmed them. "Stay close," Reynolds shouted, but Eleanor felt a pull toward the stone, something she couldn't explain. As she reached out to touch it, a vision flashed before her eyes, images of the world before, when this planet had been beautiful, teeming with life. But then, something terrible had happened. The inhabitants had found something in the stone, something that had twisted them, changed them into these horrors. And then, the vision shifted. She saw herself, not just herself, but the entire crew, transformed, twisted like the others. Eleanor's fingers hovered just above the pulsating stone, its cold surface vibrating beneath her touch, sending a chill through her body that felt like it was coming from the core of the planet itself. The visions came faster now, a kaleidoscope of images from a time long gone, from a civilization that had once thrived on this world. She saw them, the beings who had lived here before, tall, elegant creatures with perfect, symmetrical bodies, their faces serene in expression. They had been like gods, or so it seemed. But something had gone wrong. The images shifted again. She saw them begin to change, to distort. The sleek, smooth forms began to twist and warp, the serene expressions replaced with horrific, agonized faces, their bodies turning into horrific parodies of what they once were. The ground cracked open, and vast, insect-like creatures emerged from the depths, dragging their twisted, bloated bodies across the surface of the planet. Elena recoiled, a wave of nausea hitting her as the vision blurred. She staggered back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. It wasn't just the creatures that had changed. The planet itself had been infected, corrupted by something deeper than evolution, gone awry. It was this stone, this ancient artifact. The stone was the source. Eleanor's hand trembled as she pulled it back, but the energy was already inside her. She could feel it buzzing beneath her skin like a live wire, feeding on her fear, feeding on her desperation. She was linked to it now, connected in a way that was both terrifying and inevitable. Her mind flashed to the crew, fighting for their lives just behind her. They didn't know what she had seen, the truth of this place. the slow, twisted corruption that had consumed everything, turning the inhabitants of this world into the monsters they were now. The truth was even worse than she could have imagined. The stone had not just corrupted the planet's inhabitants, it had corrupted their evolution. They had used it to elevate themselves, to achieve something beyond mere biology, beyond what any living creature should aspire to. The result was a world of nightmares, an endless cycle of consumption, mutation, and madness. And now that same force was threatening to infect her crew. A low rumbling echoed through the chamber, snapping Eleanor back to the present. "We have to destroy it!" Reynolds' voice cut through the chaos as he sprinted toward her. His face was a mask of desperation. "Eleanor, you have to let go of it!" The creatures were drawing closer now, their twisted bodies moving in a jerky, unnatural rhythm. Their eyes were locked onto the crew, glowing with an insidious hunger. The creatures roared as they approached, their mouths opening wide, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth, dripping with saliva. The stench of decay was overpowering. Eleanor stumbled backward, her mind racing. She had to stop them, had to prevent the stone from affecting them, from taking them too. But how? Her fingers brushed the stone again, and another vision washed over her. A memory of the ancient beings, their once immaculate forms now grotesque and mutated. They had tried to use the stone to achieve immortality, to control the planet and bend it to their will. They had succeeded, in a way. But the price had been their souls, their minds, and their bodies. They had become something else entirely. Something not human, she realized with a shock that felt like ice water pouring down her spine. That the stone was not just a tool, it was a trap. A trap for anyone who dared to use it, a trap for anyone who tried to control the evolution of life itself. And she had fallen into it. Her body felt heavy, like the stone's energy was pulling her deeper into its thrall. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. Her vision was blurring, her body betraying her. The creatures were almost upon them now, the air crackling with their malevolent energy. "We don't have time," Reynolds said, his voice a frantic whisper. "Eleanor, let it go." But she couldn't. The pull was too strong, too invasive. She could hear the stone's whisper in her mind now, a dark, seductive voice, coaxing her to accept it, to embrace its power. It was almost too tempting. A sudden thought slammed into her mind. Was this what the original inhabitants had felt? Had they been seduced by the power, just as she was? She shook her head violently, trying to dispel the thought, but the stone's presence grew, pressing down on her chest like a weight she could not escape. Her hand, almost of its own accord, began to press harder against it. "No," she gasped. "I have to stop this." With every ounce of strength she had left, Eleanor pulled her hand away, stumbling back and collapsing to the ground. The stone's energy screeched in her mind, a high-pitched sound that made her head spin. And then, for a moment, everything went silent. The creatures froze, their bodies rigid as though they were statues. The energy in the room pulsed, a sickly red glow that seemed to envelop everything. The air was thick with a palpable sense of foreboding. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as she fought to regain control of her mind, trying to push back the stone's influence. "Get up," Reynolds said urgently. "We don't have much time." But Eleanor couldn't move. Her limbs felt like lead, her thoughts scattered. She could barely focus, could barely comprehend what was happening. She could still feel the stone's presence, even now, lingering like a ghost, pressing against her mind, trying to draw her back. The creatures were stirring once more, but this time there was something different, something worse. The atmosphere in the chamber had shifted. The creatures' bodies began to twitch and crack. Their forms were warping, shifting as though they were evolving again, adapting to the new energy that was now coursing through the chamber. And then, Eleanor realized with horror, it wasn't just the creatures that were changing. It was the entire planet. The stone's power wasn't just feeding off her. It was feeding off them, the crew, the survivors, all of them. The creatures were not just evolving, they were mutating. Before she could cry out, the ground beneath them cracked open, and more of the grotesque creatures emerged, their bodies even larger now, their eyes glowing with an intelligence that was even more terrifying than before. The sound of their screeches reverberated through the chamber like a cacophony of madness. Elena felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, the walls of the structure trembling as the planet seemed to come alive, responding to the energy of the stone. It was too late. There was no escape. The cycle had begun again. The creatures surged forward, but this time they were faster, stronger. Their bodies seemed to have adapted to the strange, unnatural energy in the chamber, and they were more deadly than ever. "Elena," Reynolds yelled, his voice now frantic. "We need to go, now!" But she couldn't move. The stone's power was too strong, too overwhelming. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the air thick with suffocating heat. She could feel the others retreating behind her, but it was already too late. The creature in front of her was huge, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. Its skin was like thick, glistening chitin, and it moved with unnatural speed. Eleanor watched in horror as it lunged at one of her teammates, its jaws snapping shut with a sickening crunch. The world around her seemed to slow as the monsters began their assault. But Eleanor's mind was still tangled with the stone's influence, and she couldn't bring herself to move. She was frozen. There was no more time for answers. This was no longer just a fight for survival. This was the end. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, each beat shaking her from the inside. The chaos around her seemed to fade in and out as the stone's influence tightened its grip on her, pulling her deeper into its thrall. She could feel it now, almost as if it was part of her, wrapping tendrils of power around her consciousness, whispering in her mind like a seductive serpent. "Don't let it control you," a voice said, sharp and urgent. Eleanor blinked, trying to focus through the fog of dizziness and nausea that had consumed her. It was Reynolds. His face was grim, his expression filled with determination and fear. "Reynolds," Eleanor whispered, her voice shaky. She could barely speak, her throat tight, but she could hear his words even through the haze in her mind. "You need to snap out of it," he said, urgency in his tone. "We don't have much time. The creatures, they're getting stronger. We need to leave, now." She wanted to answer him, but the stone, the terrible pulsing stone, was still there in her mind, its call too powerful to ignore. Her fingers itched to reach for it again, to embrace it, to feel that surge of raw, intoxicating power. It was so close, but even in her fractured state, a part of her recognized the truth. The stone wasn't just a source of power. It was a parasite. It fed on their fear, their weakness, their desperation. If she allowed herself to succumb to it, she would never leave this place, not just her, the others too. "Reynolds, we can't leave. The stone, it's linked to everything here. The creatures, the changes. It's why this planet is like this," Eleanor cried out, struggling to force her words through the fog. "We have to stop it. We have to destroy the stone." But Reynolds didn't respond the way she expected. Instead of fighting her decision, he stepped closer, grabbing her shoulders and shaking her. "Eleanor," he hissed through clenched teeth. "This is not a discussion. We're not equipped to deal with whatever this thing is. We're fighting for our lives here. The stone is not our salvation. It's our doom." Eleanor stumbled backward as the truth of his words hit her like a slap to the face. She couldn't focus. The urge to fall back into the stone's embrace was overwhelming. But the more Reynolds' words rang in her ears, the more her reality shifted, like the fog lifting from her mind. "Snap out of it," Reynolds said again, his hands firm on her shoulders, grounding her. The stone's pull was still there, its pulse still thrumming inside her chest, but it was weaker now. Maybe it had never been as strong as it had seemed in the first place. Maybe she was stronger, than it had given her credit for. Her breathing steadied, her heart still racing, but now with purpose. She blinked and found herself staring directly at the stone, its surface glinting darkly. She could feel it still, a hum of energy in the air around her. But she fought against the growing desire to reach for it again. "I can't let it win," she whispered to herself, and the words were like a rallying cry. She straightened, gathering every ounce of her willpower. "We have to get out of here and destroy it, now." Reynolds gave her a hard, searching look, and then, finally, he nodded. "All right, let's get out of here," he said, his voice steady, but his eyes still filled with that unshakable fear. Before they could move, a high-pitched, guttural scream shattered the silence. The creatures had regrouped, and they were no longer just attacking randomly. Now they seemed coordinated, organized, as if the very planet itself had begun to wake up and respond to their presence. The remaining crew members were scattered, their backs pressed to the walls as the creatures closed in on them. "We're running out of time," Reynolds yelled, grabbing Elena's arm and pulling her away from the altar. "Move!" The chamber was a hellish battleground now. Creatures lurched forward with terrifying speed, their insectoid bodies skittering across the floor, their many limbs creating a sickening clattering noise as they moved. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the sharp, shrill cries of the creatures filled the space, echoing off the stone walls. Elena could see the others still fighting, trying to fend off the grotesque monsters that were now closing in on them. Dr. Green was struggling to reload at his weapon as one of the creatures lunged toward him, its claws extended, its face twisted into a grotesque sneer. But before the monster could strike, a blast of energy shot out from behind them. It was Reynolds, firing his weapon with precision. "Move!" Reynolds barked, pushing Eleanor ahead of him as the creature staggered back. He was right. They needed to get to the exit before it was too late. The entire planet seemed to be in motion now, the ground cracking and groaning, as if it too was alive, responding to the chaos in the air. But Eleanor's mind kept going back to the stone. The feeling, the pull. It was stronger again, and her limbs felt heavy. She fought against it, trying to push it back, but it was like swimming against a current. The stone wanted her to succumb. It was feeding off her, pulling at her thoughts, drowning her in its malevolent energy. "We have to get to the shuttle," Reynolds shouted, his voice desperate. "Eleanor, please, focus." Eleanor turned to him, seeing the panic in his eyes. She knew he was right, but the path ahead was clear only for a moment before it was obscured by another wave of grotesque creatures, faster, more vicious than before. "We can't just fight them all," Eleanor screamed, realizing the horrifying truth. "The shuttle's not enough. If we don't stop the stone, we'll bring this curse with us wherever we go. This planet, its influence, it'll follow us. We'll never escape." Reynolds looked at her, wild-eyed, and then his gaze dropped to the stone behind her. He understood. Then, like a spark igniting a wildfire, something shifted in the air. A low rumble, a vibration that seemed to shake the ground itself, filled the chamber. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "It's too late," she whispered, and her voice broke under the weight of the realization. The creatures stopped. For a moment, everything was still. And then, like a tidal wave breaking upon a shore, the ground beneath them trembled violently. The stone flared with an unnatural brightness. The chamber shuddered, as if the planet were alive, reacting to their presence, to the desecration they had caused by disturbing the altar. The entire city seemed to groan, its decayed structures crumbling and collapsing. In that moment, it was as if the planet itself had decided to reject them, to cleanse itself of their presence. And it wasn't just the creatures they had to worry about anymore. The walls of the chamber cracked, fissures splitting open, and the very foundation of the city began to collapse around them. The creatures began to swarm again, but this time it wasn't just for food. It was a war for survival. "Run!" Reynolds shouted, pulling Elena away, as the ground beneath them cracked open, splitting wide. The creatures, now maddened, lashed out, desperate to stop them from escaping. The walls were collapsing, the ceiling falling in on them. It was their last chance. They had to survive. Elena and Reynolds fought their way through the chaos. Behind them, the others were following, but the path was narrowing. With each step, they could feel the heat of the collapsing city, the shrieks of the monsters, and the unbearable pressure of the stone's power pressing down on them. The shuttle was in sight. Just a few more steps, but the creatures were coming. They were faster now, adapting to the environment, using the very chaos of the collapsing city to their advantage. Elena glanced over her shoulder, fear surging as she saw the vast shape of a creature leaping at them from the shadows. "We need to hurry!" Reynolds shouted, pushing forward, but Eleanor was frozen. The stone's influence was still there, still pulsing through her veins. She could feel it, could hear it, whispering in the back of her mind. It was calling to her. Eleanor's breath hitched as her vision blurred. "Just a little closer," the stone whispered. "You could have everything you've ever wanted. Power, control, immortality." But it wasn't just the stone calling to her. It was the planet. It wanted her to stay. It wanted her to be a part of it. To be part of the cycle that had consumed everything. With one final, desperate breath, Eleanor shook off the stone's influence. "We have to go," she said, her voice breaking. And this time, she meant it. She turned to run, but the monsters were closing in. Faster than she could have anticipated, Reynolds pushed her forward, and they both dove into the shuttle, barely avoiding the creatures as they swarmed the door. The others followed in a mad scramble, but the creatures were relentless, clawing at the shuttle's walls. The engines roared to life, the shuttle shaking as the door slammed shut, sealing them inside. But as they ascended into the air, Eleanor's mind raced. It wasn't over. The stone's power still lingered, and now it was following them. The shuttle shot through the atmosphere, its engines roaring as they ascended into the black sky. The roar of the creatures below, their unearthly shrieks, echoed in Eleanor's mind. But as the planet grew smaller and smaller beneath them, a deep, unsettling silence descended over the crew. The pressure that had gripped Eleanor's chest, the sickening pull of the stone's power, was still there. A faint hum just beneath the surface of her thoughts. Her heart raced. They were safe for now. The shuttle was intact, and the crew had escaped the decaying ruins of the planet. But Eleanor knew, deep down, that their troubles were far from over. They had disturbed something ancient, something that would not be easily silenced. As the shuttle's trajectory shifted, taking them farther from the doomed world, Eleanor looked out the viewport, her thoughts swirling. She could still feel the stone's presence, a ghostly tug in the back of her mind. Its call hadn't ceased. It was merely dormant, biding its time. Reynolds approached her, his face drawn with exhaustion and dread. "We made it out," he said, but there was no triumph in his voice, only a hollow edge. "But what now?" Eleanor couldn't answer him. She had no words for what had happened, no explanations for the nightmare they had survived. They had lost good people, people who wouldn't ever return. But the worst part, it wasn't just the death. It was the feeling that they hadn't just escaped the planet. The planet had let them go. The planet, the stone. She couldn't shake the feeling that it had allowed them to leave, for now. "We can't go back," Reynolds continued, more to himself than to her. "We can't. If we bring that thing with us." She shook her head, unable to complete the sentence. They had no idea if the stone's influence would fade, or if it would follow them, infecting them all. What if they had already been marked, their minds already corrupted? What if it was too late? Eleanor. Reynolds' voice softened. "You need to let it go. Whatever happened back there, the stone, the creatures, everything, you need to put it behind you, for your own sake." But the pull of the stone was undeniable. Even now, as she sat in the silence of the shuttle, she could feel its cold touch like a shiver running through her bones. She knew it was still there, somewhere deep in the recesses of her mind, its presence coiled like a serpent waiting to strike. For the first time, Eleanor truly understood what had happened on that world. The stone wasn't just a source of power. It was a prison, one that trapped the minds of those who sought it, drawing them into a never-ending cycle of consumption and mutation. The people of that world, those elegant, godlike beings, had thought they could control it. But in the end, they had become something unrecognizable. Their evolution had been hijacked, twisted into something monstrous. And now, the stone had chosen her. She knew what they had to do. She had to stop it before it could take root in them all. There would be no escape if it managed to latch onto their minds. "We can't outrun it," Eleanor whispered to herself. "We can't outrun it." Reynolds didn't seem to understand at first. He stood beside her, staring at her with a mix of concern and confusion. "Eleanor?" She could feel it now, the cold weight of the stone's power bearing down on her once more. It had always been there, waiting for the right moment to strike. It wasn't going to let them go so easily. "No," she said firmly, her voice shaking but determined. "We have to destroy it." Reynolds' eyes widened. "What? Destroy it? We barely survived that place, and now you—" "I don't care," Eleanor snapped, her voice rising with urgency. "We can't just run. We can't take it with us. If we do, if we let it follow us, we'll all end up like the ones who came before. That's how this curse works, Reynolds. It's not about physical destruction. It's about corruption. It'll turn us into something else." Reynolds looked around the shuttle as if for the first time, realizing the true gravity of her words. The others were silent, their faces pale and exhausted, but their eyes were filled with doubt. They had barely escaped with their lives. The last thing they wanted was to head back into the heart of that nightmare. But they could all feel it now, the unease, the unspoken dread that had settled in. Eleanor's thoughts turned back to the stone, to the moment when she had touched it. It wasn't just a material object, a simple artifact. It was a conduit, a link to something much darker, something that spread. The creatures, the mutated horrors, they had been the product of that stone, twisted by its influence over countless generations. But there was something worse, something far more sinister than she could understand, and they had carried part of it with them. A wave of sickness washed over Eleanor as she realized what she had to do. She had no choice. "I have to destroy it," she whispered again. But this time she knew what it meant. "You can't," Reynolds pleaded, his voice breaking. "It'll kill you. You don't know what it could do." "I know exactly what it does," Eleanor said quietly, her mind made up. "It doesn't just kill. It changes. It destroys everything that it touches. And if I don't stop it now, it will take us all." The shuttle was heading out of the planet's orbit, into the void of space. The stars twinkled outside, cold and distant. The hum of the engines was steady, but there was an underlying tension in the air that none of them could shake. Eleanor's hand hovered over the console. She knew what she had to do. She didn't know how to destroy it, but she had to try. There was no other way. Her fingers hovered over the emergency override button. Before she could push it, a voice echoed in her mind. "Stop." The voice was familiar. It was the stone. Its power, its call, reverberated deep within her thoughts, tightening its grip. "You cannot stop me. I am inevitable." Her fingers twitched, but she fought it. "No," she thought. "This ends now." With a final, desperate surge of will, Eleanor slammed her hand down on the button. The shuttle shuddered violently as the engines powered down. The walls vibrate as the ship was momentarily thrown into darkness. For a brief moment, everything seemed to go silent. The weight of the stone's influence vanished, and then a blinding flash. A deafening roar filled her ears as the shuttle erupted in a violent explosion of light and sound, consuming everything in its wake. The stone, that terrible curse that had haunted them all, shattered into a million pieces. The last remnants of its power disintegrated in an instant, leaving nothing but the emptiness of space. The darkness swallowed everything, and then silence. When Eleanor awoke, she found herself floating in the cold void of space. Her body was weightless, drifting in the aftermath of the destruction. The shuttle had vanished. The stone was gone. The power, the corruption, all of it had been erased. But as she looked around, her heart sank. The crew was gone. She was alone. The universe stretched out before her, infinite and cold. But in the distance there was a faint, insidious pulse, a flicker. The stone hadn't been destroyed. It had only been delayed.